Most people misunderstand consistency as a personality trait, something you're either born with or without. But in reality, consistency is not something you inherit. It's something you create. It's not genetic. It's neuroplastic, and that distinction changes everything. When you understand that consistency is trainable, just like strength, endurance, or memory, you realize that every action you take is a vote not just for who you are now, but for the circuitry you're building in your brain. Your brain doesn't operate on vague intention. It operates on patterns, and those patterns are shaped through a mechanism called Huberman learning, the principle that neurons that fire together wire together. This means that each time you act consistently, even if it's small, even if it's difficult, you are strengthening a neural pathway. You are literally carving a groove into your brain that makes the next repetition easier and the one after that even more automatic. So how do you train consistency? You start by reducing the friction between intention and execution. Your nervous system is optimized for survival, not progress. Left on autopilot, it will always favor the familiar. It prefers safety over uncertainty, routine over challenge, and conservation of energy over expenditure. Consistency requires overriding that default setting, and the way you do that is not by relying on motivation, which is volatile, but by designing systems that reduce variability in behavior. Start by anchoring your actions to time and context. Your brain forms what are called temporal associations, meaning it links specific behaviors to specific times of day and environments. If you always train at 7 a.m., the act of waking up and moving to your training space begins to cue a predictable neurochemical cascade: cortisol for alertness, dopamine for motivation, and adrenaline for mobilization. Over time, this becomes automatic. You're not just thinking about working out. Your physiology begins to expect it. This is how you move from conscious effort to subconscious routine. That's the goal, not to keep forcing yourself, but to build a system so practiced that it becomes your baseline. It's the same mechanism musicians use when developing muscle memory. It's the same system that allows athletes to perform complex movements without overthinking, and it's available to you in the realm of consistency. Another key to making consistency trainable is understanding behavioral thresholds. The brain is far more responsive to repeated exposure than it is to intensity. In other words, it's better to show up daily for 20 minutes than once a week for 2 hours. High-frequency, low-threshold behaviors are more neurologically sticky. They produce more reliable wiring, and this is especially important in the beginning, when the nervous system is still forming the initial scaffold of a new habit. You also need to leverage the role of emotion in behavioral encoding. Emotionally charged experiences are prioritized in memory because they trigger higher levels of neuromodulators like norepinephrine and dopamine. That's why forcing yourself to act on difficult days is such a powerful training stimulus. When you act in spite of resistance, physical, emotional, cognitive, your brain tags that experience as meaningful. It's marked as significant, which increases the likelihood that you'll repeat it. That is consistency training at the cellular level. People often wait for the path to become easier. They think, once I feel better, or once life calms down, or once I have more time. But those are delay signals, not green lights. If you train your nervous system to only act when the external conditions are perfect, you're reinforcing inconsistency. You're training flinch, hesitation, avoidance. But if you act in the presence of stress, of noise, of fatigue, you're building a brain that defaults to engagement. And that's the kind of brain that achieves. To further reinforce consistency, you need immediate feedback loops. The brain thrives on short-term wins. You don't have to wait weeks or months for motivation. You can create it within seconds by closing behavioral loops. Every time you complete a session, mark it physically, write it down, track it, signal completion in a tangible way. This creates what's called a dopaminergic reward loop. The completion itself becomes rewarding. That's crucial because you're teaching your brain to associate the process, not just the result, with positive reinforcement. Consistency is also about self-trust. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a small one, you rebuild that trust. And self-trust is a form of certainty. It tells the brain, when I say I'm going to do something, I follow through. That certainty reduces cognitive load. It removes the internal debate. And that's one of the biggest enemies of consistency: hesitation. When you hesitate, you give the limbic system, the emotional brain, an opening to override the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic and planning. Training consistency is training decisiveness. None of this is about being robotic. It's about being adaptive. It's about knowing that, just like training a muscle, you can train your behavioral systems. Consistency isn't about being perfect. It's about creating a tight loop between intention and execution. You act, you adjust, you repeat, and the repetition creates identity. You no longer try to be consistent, you are consistent, because that's the neural and behavioral system you've installed through repetition under pressure. Dopamine is widely misunderstood. Most people think it's simply the molecule of pleasure, the neurochemical that spikes when you achieve something rewarding, but that's only a fraction of its function. Dopamine is much more accurately described as the molecule of motivation, pursuit, and effort. It drives you toward goals, fuels sustained action, and reinforces behaviors that lead to desirable outcomes. And the most critical insight here is this: dopamine doesn't just spike when you succeed, it spikes during the effort, the striving, the pushing forward. That changes how we think about consistency entirely. When you learn to associate effort itself with a dopamine reward, you train your brain to crave the process, not just the result. This is a fundamental shift. Most people only feel good when they hit the goal, when they cross the finish line. But if you rely solely on outcome-based dopamine, you'll struggle to be consistent because most days you won't see dramatic results. Most days are work without reward, at least from the outside. But internally, neurochemically, you can generate reward from the effort itself. That is what high performers do, whether they realize it or not. Dopamine is produced in a set of neurons that reside in the ventral tegmental area (VTA) and substantia nigra of the midbrain. These neurons project to various areas, especially the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex, key areas for motivation, planning, and behavioral reinforcement. When dopamine is released in these pathways, it enhances the salience of whatever activity you're engaged in. That salience tells the brain, this matters, pay attention, do more of this. Now, what determines when and how much dopamine is released? It's not just the reward itself, it's the perception of progress toward the reward. This is what's referred to as the dopaminergic treadmill. You get a surge of dopamine when you're chasing something and making traction, even before you've completed it. That means the pursuit, the act of showing up, applying effort, facing resistance is itself neurochemically rewarding if your brain is trained to see it that way. This is where subjective framing becomes crucial. If you see effort as punishment, as something to get through, your brain does not release as much dopamine. But if you consciously tell yourself, and this is supported by research out of Stanford and other institutions, that effort is valuable, that strain is desirable, that friction is a sign of progress, you amplify the dopamine response. The story you tell yourself about effort changes the neurochemical outcome of that effort. That's a powerful lever for consistency. Let's apply this directly. Say you're training early in the morning. You're tired, it's cold, your body is not cooperating. You could frame it as misery, or you could frame it as adaptation. If you say to yourself, this is the moment where I get better when I act in spite of resistance, you get a spike in dopamine from the effort itself. And that spike reinforces the action. That feedback loop makes it easier to repeat tomorrow. This is not motivational fluff. It's biochemical reality. Every time you pair effort with dopamine, you strengthen the circuit that says doing hard things is rewarding. And that's the key to becoming consistent. You're not chasing ease. You're chasing the internal reward that comes from showing up, from leaning into the process, from engaging with the challenge. There's also something important to understand about baseline dopamine. You have both a baseline level of dopamine, your default setting, and peaks of dopamine that occur in response to behavior. If you constantly seek dopamine peaks from external rewards like social media, junk food, or passive entertainment, you deplete your dopamine system over time. Your baseline drops, and when that happens, motivation becomes harder to access. Even things you used to enjoy can feel dull or meaningless. That's not a willpower issue. It's a neurochemical imbalance created by overstimulation. The solution is not to eliminate dopamine, you need it, but to earn it, to train your system to generate dopamine from effortful activities that align with long-term goals. This kind of effort-induced dopamine not only increases your peaks, but raises your baseline over time. When your baseline dopamine is healthy, you're more motivated, more focused, more able to take consistent action without needing constant novelty or external validation. You can support this system by being intentional with your environment and routines. For example, avoid stacking multiple high dopamine behaviors back to back. Don't follow a workout with social media scrolling, fast food, and gaming. You're confusing the system. Instead, allow the dopamine from the effort to settle, to be associated with the training itself. You're teaching your brain this is the source of reward. That clarity allows the dopamine system to strengthen around meaningful behaviors. There's also a compounding effect. The more you engage in effort-based dopamine behaviors, the more your brain prioritizes those circuits. That's neuroplasticity at work. You begin to crave the work. You begin to want the discomfort, because on a deep neurological level, you've linked that discomfort to progress. That's how consistent people are built, not by loving the process at first, but by rewarding themselves internally for facing it again and again until craving replaces avoidance. When dopamine is aligned with effort, consistency is no longer a battle. It becomes your default, not your exception. You don't need to psych yourself up every morning. You don't need to bribe yourself with external rewards. Your brain has been trained to associate pursuit with pleasure. That is the secret, using biology not against you, but in your favor. And it starts with shifting the reward from outcome to action, from destination to the path itself. Motivation is unreliable. It's transient, emotion-based, and highly dependent on your internal state and external environment. When it's there, it can feel like a wave of energy carrying you forward, but when it's gone, most people stall. That's where people get it wrong. They think consistency is about constantly feeling motivated. It's not. It's about reducing your dependence on motivation entirely. You do that by replacing motivation with structure. Protocols, deliberate, repeatable systems are what allow you to take action regardless of how you feel. That's the architecture of consistency. A protocol is more than a routine. It's a set of conditions you create to support behavior execution, especially under stress, fatigue, or resistance. Your nervous system craves predictability. It thrives when there's a clear path to follow. Protocols give your brain something to orient around. They remove ambiguity. They reduce the cognitive load of deciding what to do and when to do it. And they allow your body to act even when your mind resists. That's critical because under stress, the brain favors the limbic system, emotional, reactive, impulsive, unless you've trained otherwise. Protocols give the prefrontal cortex, the planning, executive center, a stronger voice. A well-structured protocol starts with initiation. This is the moment you transition from passivity to action. It could be a breathwork routine, a movement cue, light exposure, or cold exposure. These are not random wellness trends, they are tools that shift your physiology. For example, a single session of deliberate cold exposure like an ice bath or cold shower increases norepinephrine levels significantly, sharpening focus and alertness for hours afterward. It also shifts the autonomic nervous system into a sympathetic tone, meaning you're more prepared to act. Similarly, early morning light exposure directly affects the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which governs your circadian rhythm. This increases cortisol at the right time of day, not as a stress hormone, but as an alertness hormone. That creates a natural rise in energy that aligns with the initiation of your work or training. These are not motivational hacks. They are tools to shape your neurophysiology in a way that makes action more likely and more sustainable. Once you initiate, you move into deep work, the zone of sustained, focused effort. This is where structure matters most. Your brain operates in ultradian rhythms, 90 to 120-minute cycles of high focus followed by dips in energy. Trying to work or train continuously without honoring these rhythms leads to burnout and inconsistency. Instead, create 90-minute windows where your phone is off, your environment is controlled, and your attention is singular. During these windows, minimize task switching. Each time you switch tasks, you incur a cost in terms of attention and dopamine. The more fragmented your focus, the harder it becomes to access deep work states in the future. You're literally training distraction. To maintain these work cycles over time, you need resets, deliberate recovery built into the system. This could be a short walk, non-sleep deep rest NSDR, or focused breathing. NSDR, in particular, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, allowing for rapid recovery of both mental and physical energy. It also enhances consolidation of learning and primes the brain for another round of deep focus. Without these resets, your performance will decline across the day, and the brain will start associating work with depletion instead of engagement. That's a threat to consistency. The full protocol becomes: initiate with a state-shifting behavior, engage in structured deep work aligned with ultradian cycles, and reset to recover and re-engage. You don't wait for motivation. You don't wonder whether you feel like it. You execute the system, and over time, the repetition of this sequence conditions the nervous system. Your brain learns, when X happens, we do Y. That's behavioral automation. That's what removes friction. And when friction is reduced, consistency increases. There's also a biochemical reinforcement that takes place within these protocols. Each time you complete a cycle of effort, even a small one, and follow it with acknowledgement of completion, you get a dopamine release. This doesn't have to be dramatic. It could be writing a checkmark in a journal, speaking a phrase like "done," or even just sitting with the internal signal of completion. That feedback loop is how you teach your brain that structure equals reward. The protocol becomes inherently satisfying even before the larger goal is achieved. Another aspect of protocol-driven consistency is what's called anticipatory regulation. Your nervous system learns to anticipate stress and regulate ahead of time. If you've done cold exposure 100 times, your body doesn't panic the same way on the 101st. If you've initiated deep work at the same hour for a month, your brain begins preparing focus circuits before you even begin. This pre-activation reduces resistance. You don't have to push through. Your system is already leaning forward. You also become less reactive to emotional interference. Because the protocol takes precedence, mood becomes background noise. You don't skip training because you're anxious. You don't avoid work because you're uninspired. The protocol holds the behavior stable, and over time, your emotional volatility decreases. That's not just a psychological benefit, it's a nervous system adaptation. You're developing what's called autonomic resilience, the ability to take action regardless of emotional or physiological stressors. This kind of system doesn't eliminate variability in life, it gives you a container to operate within it. Chaos will still happen. You will still have setbacks, fatigue, distraction. But when the protocol is stronger than the resistance, action wins. And the more you act in the presence of resistance, the more that becomes your default pattern. Consistency is no longer about how you feel. It's about what you do, and protocols make that possible without needing to negotiate with your own mind every time. Consistency isn't tested when everything is going well. It's tested when your system is under pressure, when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, when nothing in your environment is cooperating, and your internal state is pushing you toward retreat instead of action. That's where the real work begins. Anyone can show up when the conditions are ideal, but the nervous system adapts in moments of friction. It learns under stress. And the consistency that lasts, the kind that shapes identity and rewires circuitry, is forged when you act despite every reason not to. The brain is constantly evaluating input. It scans for energy availability, perceived threat, novelty, and reward. When things feel difficult, when your schedule is off, your emotions are intense, or your body feels depleted, your limbic system flags that as a potential threat. It's trying to protect you from burning out, from wasting energy. That system isn't broken, it's just old. It evolved to help humans survive scarcity, danger, and unpredictability. But modern life is different. Most of the resistance we face today is not a threat to survival, it's a challenge to growth. That distinction matters. To stay consistent, you have to teach your nervous system that discomfort is not danger. You have to create an internal signal that says, I see the resistance and I act anyway. This doesn't come from willpower. It comes from repetition under tension. Each time you act in the presence of limbic friction, that internal pushback to taking action, you weaken the association between discomfort and avoidance. You create a new pattern. Discomfort equals engagement. That's what rewires the circuit. That's what allows consistency to take root in every context, not just the convenient ones. You have to understand that every behavior you engage in either strengthens or weakens a neural pathway. If you skip your process because you're stressed, you're not just avoiding action, you're reinforcing avoidance. The brain doesn't register taking a break as a neutral event. It sees it as a directional signal. This is how we respond when things get hard. And it stores that response for future reference. That's how habits form, not just at the behavioral level, but deep within the architecture of the brain. But the opposite is also true. When you show up, especially when it's hard, the behavior becomes encoded as significant. It's tagged with neuromodulators like dopamine and norepinephrine, which say, this matters. That signal increases the likelihood that the behavior will repeat, not because it was easy, but because it was effortful and deliberate. This is the biology of grit. You don't build resilience by reading about it or waiting until you feel ready. You build it by acting through resistance over and over until the act itself becomes a conditioned response. Failure is part of this process, not in the cliché sense of failing forward, but in the neurological sense of feedback. When you miss a session, lose focus, or break a streak, the brain registers an error. And if you respond to that error with correction, not self-punishment, but adjustment, you create plasticity. The brain learns from errors far more deeply than from success, but only if those errors are followed by realignment. If you fall off your system and stay off, the brain learns a pattern of collapse. But if you fall off and return immediately, without delay, you train what's called reactivation, the ability to re-engage quickly after disruption. That's one of the most valuable forms of consistency. Consistency is also about emotion regulation. The emotional brain, the amygdala, insula, limbic networks, reacts quickly and powerfully to perceived threat, whether that's failure, criticism, or uncertainty. But through deliberate practice, the prefrontal cortex can learn to override those signals. This is not about suppression, it's about integration. You don't try to eliminate fear, anxiety, or fatigue. You act with them in the system. You allow them to be present while still executing the protocol. That trains what's called top-down control, the ability of higher cognitive circuits to steer behavior even when lower circuits are firing alarms. In those moments, consistency becomes identity. You're no longer someone who tries to stay on track. You're someone who is consistent, even when things break down. That's a shift in self-concept, and it's supported by a feedback loop between behavior, belief, and biology. When you act in line with your protocol in moments of high emotional or physical stress, you get a surge of confidence that isn't abstract, it's embodied. It's encoded through the very circuits that used to signal avoidance. That's transformation at the neural level. The mistake people make is believing they need to solve their emotional state before they can act. They think, I need to calm down, or I need to feel better, or I need to be inspired again. But that's backwards. Action is what regulates emotion. Action is what brings clarity. The nervous system doesn't just respond to your thoughts, it responds to your behavior. When you move forward, even in a small way, you shift the entire chemistry of the system. You increase dopamine, which elevates motivation. You increase norepinephrine, which sharpens focus. You activate frontal circuits, which dampen emotional reactivity. That's the neurobiology of momentum. This is why the most important reps are the ones you don't want to take. The sessions when you feel flat, the work you do when you're anxious, the moments you follow through when your system is screaming to quit, those are the conditions under which consistency becomes automatic. You've shown the brain that conditions do not dictate behavior, and once that lesson is learned, the variability of life no longer breaks your system. You are able to show up under noise, under stress, under fatigue, because showing up has become the baseline. The default, not because it's easy, but because it's trained.